African countries may face higher inflation and sustained monetary policy rate tightening on Red Sea crisis. Stakeholders have highlighted the urgent need for sustainable development in Africa, emphasizing the need for climate-smart investment. Africa's most industrialized economy launches carbon capture technology. These are the talking points on the show today. Welcome to Business Edge. I am Perpetua, Fasanmi-Peter. Well, we'll begin with top business headlines from across the continent. Dangote Petroleum Refinery has commenced nationwide sales of diesel, promising to soon release aviation fuel. The move, confirmed by dealers and officials, is expected to lower diesel prices, responding to recent highs. The refinery, inaugurated in 2023, faced regulatory hurdles, delaying product releases. A statement from Aliko Dangote expressed gratitude to President Bola Tinubu and regulatory bodies for their support. The refinery's early announcements about diesel and aviation fuel production have now materialized, marking a significant milestone in Nigeria's petroleum industry. The Private Telecommunications and Communications Senior Association Staff of Nigeria, PTECSAN, has announced an indefinite strike starting April 4, 2024, citing anti-labor practices by subcontractors working for Huawei Technologies Nigeria Limited. Grievances include poor working conditions, lack of entitlement, and inadequate security for field engineers. PTECSAN demands recognition of workers' rights, acknowledgement of the union, and compliance with regulations. PTECSAN, however, urges Nigerians to understand the situation during this period. Finally, despite an expanded IMF agreement and substantial investment from the UAE, Egypt's non-oil private sector experienced marginal improvement in March as per survey. The S&P Global Purchasing Managers Index for Egypt rose slightly to 47.6 from February's 47.1, but continued its streak below the growth threshold of 50% for the 40th consecutive month. Persistent weak order books and heightened inflationary pressures led to a significant downturn in activity across the non-oil private sector, denting both business output and confidence, according to S&P Global. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll take you to the market update. Stay with us, don't go away. To market watch now. The NGX All-Share Index closed Tuesday down a minus 0.04% at 104,518.14 points. Market capitalization also dipped slightly to 59.095 trillion naira. Now, despite the small decline, the market remained upbeat with 23 gainers against 17 decliners. And interestingly, banking stocks like GTCO saw increased trading activity and price gains despite the central bank's recent minimum capital requirement hike. This suggests investor interest in the sector. Now, beginning with the all-share index, let's take a look at the breakdown of yesterday's trading activities. For the all-share index, we saw, just like I said earlier, 0.04% decline, closing 104,518.14. Now, let's take a look at the market capitalization. Also, we have the same percentage change, closing 59.09 trillion naira from last Thursday's 59.12 trillion naira. Now, let's take a look at the top gainers from yesterday's market, being the first for the week. So for Prestige, it's gained 10%. We saw May and Baker gaining 10%. Ikeja Hotel 9.95%. Charms 9.90%. Unity Bank 9.66%. And this, of course, tells us the prices they all closed yesterday. Now let's take a look at the top losers from yesterday's market activities. UACN 9.82% down. Julius Berger 9.17% down. ABC Transport 9.09% down. And then we have Universal Insurance, 7.69% down. UPDC, 6.67% down. And then we have the prices here for UACN, 12 naira 40 kobo. You've got ABC Transport, 70 kobo. And then you've got UPDC, 1 naira 40 kobo. Now let's take a look at the sector performance. For sector performance, we begin with financial sector. We have the banking closing minus 0.07%. Insurance up 1.37%. And I must say that insurance has really been, doing a lot to close in the green for a while now. For oil and gas, of course, it maintains that there's 0.00. Then for consumer goods, minus 0.01%. And finally, industrial goods, minus 0.12%. And that's what we have on Market Watch for today. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another episode, of course, telling you whatever happens in the markets today. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll have our first conversation for today. Stay with us. This is Business Edge. Glad to know you stay with us. Afrexim Bank warns of higher inflation and rising interest rates across Africa in 2024 due to Red Sea attacks disrupting global trade. The report highlights uneven regional impact, with Egypt's Suez Canal traffic declining and South Africa's ports facing increased pressure due to rerouted vessels. Well, joining me to look at how this will impact Africa is Joachim, MacEbong, a policy analyst. Thank you, Joachim, for joining me today. All right, Joachim, if you can hear me, maybe you need to unmute so you can, so I can hear you.
You can't hear me. Are you sure?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Okay. All right.
So let's look at the figures, really. In the first 2 months of 2024, Suez Canal trade dropped by 50% from a year earlier, while we also saw trade through the Panama Canal falling by 32%, disrupting supply chains and, distorting key macroeconomic indicators. Help us paint a picture of the situation and how it's affecting global trade.
Yes, so with regard to the Suez Canal in particular, some of your viewers may recall that since the beginning of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in October, there have been attacks by a rebel group in Yemen called the Houthis. So these Houthis have been attacking ships that have been passing through the Red Sea. And I think that maybe having a little map up, may help viewers just situate where the Red Sea is and how that affects trade as far as Africa is concerned. Now, the Red Sea, on one end of the Red Sea, you have the Suez Canal that is run by Egypt, and on the other end, that is at the Yemen end, you have the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Now, both of these points are what they call choke points in global trade. So what that means is that if there is any disruption there, at any of those choke points, it will be difficult for ships to pass through there with ease. And since the Houthi attacks have been on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, on the other end, of the Red Sea, ships have now refused to pass. To go through the Suez Canal, because when you go to the Suez Canal, you then have to exit. At the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And now that is what is leading to, the reduction of 50% in traffic that you see through the Suez Canal. Now, the immediate impact of that is borne, first of all, by Egypt, because the Suez Canal contributes plenty of money to the coffers of Egypt. And because of that, you have their own, finances heavily affected. And also all the countries in Africa that share a border with the Red Sea. So you're looking at, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan. You have those shipments that they rely on for the imports of their staple foods and other things. Those shipments have now been seriously disrupted and are also affecting their economies as a result. Yes, so thank you for that. So you have the Suez Canal up there on the top left. And then on the other end, you have, you see Yemen there, and you see the border countries there, the African border countries that border the Red Sea. You have Egypt, Sudan, you have Eritrea, you have Djibouti, you have Somalia, and you have Ethiopia as well. So these are the countries that are immediate impact zone as it were of these trade disruptions. But the Red Sea and the Suez Canal is also important, not only because it accounts for about 15% of global trade, but it is also, and most importantly, it is a shortcut between Asia and Europe. And because it is a shortcut, it means that shipments can get around the world much faster, than they would if you. But in this case now, since there's a disruption in that area, okay, they then have to go all the way around, the African continent, down to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And then
okay, just before you continue, Joachim, I know you're already on, talking about Africa and all of that. Specifically, I would like you to probably talk about the macroeconomic implications of this for Africa.
Yes, definitely. So when you have those shipments, and those shipping costs going up, because when you have to go around the African continent, it is going to add at least 10 days to the trip. And it is also going to add, several $1,000s or several tens of thousands of dollars regarding just the cost of those shipments. So you have all of those costs that are going to be passed down to African consumers. And because of those costs being passed down or those shipments being disrupted completely, you then have those scarcities and you have those higher costs that will then definitely increase inflation on the continent. Now, again, we are only just trying to recover from the disruptions due to the Russia-Ukraine war. Your viewers will recall that there was a Black Sea grain deal, that was supposed to benefit African countries, allowing grain to exit Ukraine, and come toward and come to Africa. Now, but the problem here is that on top of that, now we are now adding this particular disruption there, and it's only going to worsen, the inflationary pressures that we have been dealing with now for nearly 2 years.
I like how you started talking about inflation. Now, Afreximbank released a report recently where it said that African countries are poised to experience heightened inflation levels and even sustained interest rate tightening throughout 2024 because of this. I mean, I'm tempted to start talking about the Nigerian story. But before we get to Nigeria, this does not sound good, or does it?
No, it doesn't. And from a geopolitical perspective, that is directly tied to economic outcomes. I wonder if there is a way that African countries through the AU can organize themselves and demand for a permanent ceasefire, in Gaza that will allow those shipments to continue, through the Red Sea.
Joachim,
so the issue is that
you made it sound so easy. We've got UN, you've got a lot of persons, powerhouses calling for the same thing, and nobody has budged. So what makes you think Africa is going to make a difference here?
Well, the African continent and African leaders have been getting increasingly involved in global conversations. They have gotten increasingly involved in conversations around climate change. They've gotten involved in conversations around ending the Ukraine war, as we have just talked about, and they're getting increasingly involved in other conversations as well. And this particular conflict that has a direct, impact on African countries, and Africans, is something that they definitely have to also add their voice to as well. It is not easy to know what particular levers they have to pull, or leverage that they have to pull, there. But it is something that they should definitely look at trying to exercise, because the longer this goes on, the higher the inflationary impact will be, and the greater the impact will be, on the various governments on the continent.
All right, I'd like you to talk about, the implication of heightened inflation for African countries, and which of these countries are likely to be more impacted by this?
Yeah, so straight away, the immediate countries that are likely to be most impacted are the ones that are, that border the Red Sea from the map that you just displayed earlier. So you have Ethiopia there, you have Somalia, you have Eritrea, you have Sudan, you have Egypt as well. And those countries are the ones that are going to be most impacted because their shipments come directly through the Red Sea. The other countries on the continent, will be impacted, but maybe not to the same degree. What they're likely to have is just the impact of greater shipping costs, and just longer wait times, with regard to the shipments coming through there. But they will also have their own impacts to deal with, and they may also need to source supply for some of these critical goods. From other places from other places in the world, depending on just the specifics of the supply chain that they're trying to deal with them.
In some countries, analysts are actually beginning to forecast when we should start saying, cooling inflation, cooling off, and, by implication, less hawkish interest rates. Nigeria, for example, targets 21.7% inflation, Now, putting this situation in perspective, should we write off 2024 as the year inflation will probably remain sticky in Africa, let's put it that way?
Well, so I think, Perpetua, the first thing to note is that various African countries have various inflation stories. So in Nigeria specifically, Nigeria's own inflation story is largely self-inflicted, first and foremost, compared to other African countries that have managed their own inflation story much better over time. So what constitutes high inflation in Nigeria, may not be seen, may not be seen as may not be tolerated elsewhere on the continent. So I think that's the first thing to think about. What African countries need to do, if you ask me, is to deal with the internal causes of inflation. So, rampant and out of control government spending, for example, and just the printing of money there. And then if they can get that under control, then they are then left with the exogenous effects, like again, that have to deal with issues of conflict from around the world. And then maybe they can mitigate that by trying to increase supply by getting supply from other countries in the meantime. But I think that the country like Nigeria specifically has a lot of internal issues that it has to deal with first of all before it can seek to gain control over its wider environment. But a lot of our issues in Nigeria specifically are self-inflicted, but you cannot really say the same for many other African countries.
Maybe you should just talk about these other African countries, maybe about two of them.
Yeah, so in a place like Egypt, for example, I think that Egypt and the government spending in Egypt, especially, has really contributed to inflation, over time, and that is also part of what they are dealing with, when they are talking about just the difficulty they have with trying to arrange, just a more stable macroeconomic environment. Some other countries have, maybe more reliant on their own domestic production to take care of their domestic needs. And if they have issues of bad weather and a low harvest, then that is going to also impact their own inflation story as well. So I think a place like Egypt also has its own internal issues, just like Nigeria. But then when they can deal with that, and they're currently in an IMF program now, I believe, when they can deal with that, then the level of inflation will drop off enough so that they can then begin to engage with the other issues like calling for a ceasefire, and insisting on a ceasefire elsewhere, so that trade can resume normally.
All right, well, we understand the sad reality. The Red Sea issue portends, especially for Egypt. We also see South Africa facing increased traffic and pressure in its ports, due to the rerouting of vessels through the Cape of Good Hope. Shouldn't this, be good for South Africa and surrounding countries?
Absolutely. So it should be good for South Africa because the Cape of Good Hope there can provide things like refueling, refueling and various other services to ships that are passing through there. However, the issues around South Africa's infrastructure and its road infrastructure, its rail infrastructure, its ports infrastructure, its electricity infrastructure, will make that are come together to make sure that this particular thing that should be a boom for them, is only just adding strain. So I think that their performance on their infrastructure over the last several years, may be giving them a problem, when it comes to fully maximizing, the benefits of the increased traffic through their ports. In past years, this might not have been such an issue, but now with the various pressures, that they have infrastructurally, then it's becoming a problem.
All right, thank you so much, Joachim, MacEbong, for your thoughts. I would have thought that, a situation like this should actually offer opportunities. But sadly, just like Nigeria, when opportunities present themselves, we always are not ready. I hope Africa will be ready some of the time.
I hope so too. Thank you for having me. All
right, bye. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we turn our attention to climate investment opportunities in Africa. Stay with us, don't go away. Experts and stakeholders in the climate change space have highlighted the urgent need for sustainable development in Africa, emphasizing the need for climate-smart investment. The continent is set to require comprehensive plans to ensure long-term economic and environmental well-being. Joining me for more on this is Marilyn Obaisa-Osula, the head ESG Sustainability and Climate Change at PwC Nigeria. Thank you for joining me today, Marilyn.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be in your midst.
All right. Well, some have classified Africa as the most vulnerable continent on Earth, adding that climate change and climate variability will likely reduce agricultural production, food security, and water security. Is this overstated?
Well, thank you. Before I answer your question, I'd just like to give a bit of context to how I generally see climate change. So, climate change is everyone's concern, and I'll explain why I say this. And simply put, we know that it's caused by the greenhouse gas that science have, explained to us over and over again, that is abundant in our atmosphere. And this gas, they trap heat. And there's a reason why I need to explain this very clearly. And this heat then causes global warming. So I haven't met one person on this planet, so far that hasn't, had one story or the other to say about the effect of climate change to them, right? Having said that, when we now come into Africa, you then get some of the arguments that, oh, if you're saying that the greenhouse gas, is the cause of the climate change and the global warming, then Africa is not guilty because we, as Africa, emit just 3 to 4% of the global greenhouse gas. The interesting thing I must say, Perpetua, about this is that these greenhouse gases do not see the maps, right? They don't see the maps. They don't see that Nigeria starts here and ends here, Africa starts here and ends here, or whatever. They don't see the map. They don't see the boundaries. They move, right? And so the fact that you emit less does not mean that you are not affected. So it's very important I lay this context, that the effects of climate change and your ability to emit or not emit do not really correlate, because you could be more impacted by the effects of climate change. So having said that, to your question, how I see vulnerability as well. Vulnerability to me is very simple, and I think that if countries, continents, subnationals and nationals, and companies and firms are looking at vulnerability this way, they will understand why climate change is important. Vulnerability is, for me, for Africa, is the extent to which we are able to mitigate our climate risk and harness the opportunities within, keeping us, making us to become resilient as a continent, and not only just resilient, we are future-proof, ready for the future, because I have already established that the effect is here, whether in terms of the risk that you've mentioned, like the food security issues, because that's relatable. Climate is tied to agriculture, or effect on health, like we see with the cooking gas, in the rural areas, and things like that. So whether we see this risk, one thing is very clear that we must look at are that there are also opportunities. So vulnerability for me is the extent to which you are able to mitigate your risk and harness your opportunities within the climate action, not denying the obvious. Thank you.
All right, I like how that you've talked about two things now, harnessing the potentials and, of course, mitigating our risks. Now, what pragmatic steps must African governments take to mitigate these risks that you have identified?
Oh, very, very quickly, I would say what comes to my mind are 4 key areas, and then a 5th one that is overarching. The first is energy. Energy, the second, let me just do a list of them, is energy. The second is finance. The third is technology, and the 4th is agriculture and food security. I feel and I believe that if African countries hinge their climate policies around these 4 areas, at least for a start, the impact will be enormous, whether into livelihoods or whether it's businesses that we're trying to stir up and all that. So just a quick deep dive into the energy part. I would say energy is key to drive economy. So whether you will like it or not, it has to be affordable, it has to be accessible, it has to be scalable, and lastly, it has to be responsible. It has to be responsible in the view of the greenhouse emissions. It has to be responsible also in the view of health. So when we look at energy as a whole, it's a new ball game. And most people would then say, but you know, we are fossil fuel based in Nigeria, and in Africa we have a lot of gas. Okay, whether you're going through your transitions, through taking gas as a transition product, or doing carbon capture to reduce the carbon intensity of your production, or going green, which we're going through the renewables, whatever it is, know for sure that energy products are going to have a lot of competition. It will not just be one product, there will be a lot of products in the energy sector competing for all of us as global citizens. So this is important for those that play in that sector. And then let me dive quickly into finance, like very important. There are a lot of opportunities within finance that we are not harnessing in Africa under the climate action. If we look at the pledges and we add them to the available funds, we're looking at close to huge billions of dollars available for us to harness. We as Africans need to look at our opportunities, and a few of this has come up. Like in South Africa, they've come up with their sustainable finance taxonomy. Nigeria, we are early adopters of the IFRS, ISSB sustainability standards for reporting, which is to help drive capital flows. We also have, we also have, the Nigerian Climate Change Act, which has hinged the recently announced blueprint, which is blueprint for our carbon markets, which is about 2.5 billion USD. So there's a lot of opportunities within the climate change action. So when people talk about climate change, like already in my conversation, I always say, while we talk about the risk, can we just harness the opportunities that sit in it? We need a lot of financing mechanisms in Africa to do that. We need a lot of banks to become accredited entities of these funds, either as intermediaries or just accredited entities as a whole. And then if you then go to technology, I don't need to talk much about technology. We know it helps us to scale. But I'd like to speak more about agriculture and food security, which a lot of people can relate with. Look, we now have, funny weather patterns. Having a base in agriculture as a person, I sometimes wonder how the farmers are coping. Our rains are not at the times where we were taught when we were in school. And so because of this, we now have technology working with agriculture to help farmers, things like early warning signs, technology that talks about, that helps grow in alternative agriculture, like soilless agriculture, like hydroponics, just things to help farmers cope. So the last overarching area is government. Having looked at finance and energy, agriculture and food security and technology, I think that most of our policies, our climate policies should dive around these areas, because I feel very strongly that these areas will really help us economically. And not only that, it will also show its impact in the livelihoods of our people. Thank you.
All right, you've talked a lot about, harnessing potentials and some of the things that can be done. I was tempted to ask you how much of these have been adopted on a large scale. You talked about agriculture. Do we have it on a large scale? Do we have government funding, some of these techniques that you've talked about? When we talk about soilless agriculture and all of that, it's probably just pockets of some persons here and there. It's not widespread yet. So how do we, probably begin to achieve that, a situation where it's widespread, it's supported by governments like you talked about, or is the challenge financing? I want us to drive this conversation home.
Yeah, there are two things. I think the main issue, one, is general awareness. I think it's just the awareness is not really there. The education on climate is not very strong. And we in PwC have taken it upon ourselves to do a lot of podcasts and fire chats to educate the people on climate change, because with that, people will begin to see a lot of opportunities. And I will get into the more opportunities later if we have time to discuss that. So that's number one. That is key. Government is to sponsor a lot of awareness sessions, workshops, seminars, just teaching people, because when you teach people, you can't control the innovation that comes out of what they've learned. That's number one. Number two is financing. And I find it difficult to understand why we worry about foreign direct investment if, in just one direction. We're not looking at it again to the direction or the eye of climate action to drive in foreign direct investment and other kinds of investment into our country, as Nigeria has all the resources that helps us, harness this investment and gain and produce and impact our GDP, as the case may be. So those are the two things for me that come readily in mind that I think will be at the hurdles. And if government can support, and even private sector can play a critical role in this will really go a long way in building our economy.
All right, talking about energy poverty, which you highlighted earlier, can we probably eradicate that without having to neglect fossil fuel, seeing the campaign for a just transition and, all the endemic, energy poverty we see in Africa? I mean, there is that concern that those who are going to say things like, okay, climate change, is an existential threat, but then the bigger threat is insecurity, the bigger threat is energy poverty and all of this. So how do we probably marry these together, or how do we strike a balance and ensure that we're talking about a just transition for Africa?
Yes, so let me crack a joke, Perpetua. Even with the fossil fuel, do we have full energy accessibility?
No, we don't, and that's the fear, that if we decide to switch, we might be overtaken by those who are faster than we are.
So what energy transition will help us do, if we look at it critically and in context of what we're doing, is help us harness more energy options, right? So let's forget about the political debate on it, but it helps us harness more energy options. So we're not just only looking at fossil fuel, we're also looking at other energy options, which are a lot. I mean, there's blue hydrogen, there's, of course, there's green hydrogen, there's the renewables in terms of solar. And the funny thing is that all the resources for the other sources of energy we do have. So it's just for governments to scale up. And, in transitioning, what was clear in COP28 was to say, we transition justly and fairly. So we are going to transition from fossil fuel, whether we are going to use carbon capture to do that, or we are going to use other technology to do that from fossil fuel. What transition simply means is taking that journey in context of development. So you don't just take that journey without development, in context of it, but of course thinking responsibly, taking these actions strategically, and also balancing it out as you transition. And really, we should not close our eyes to the other options of energy. I don't know why we are just very fixated on fossil fuel. There are other products, and I believe that in the future, these products will compete very strongly with fossil fuel. So that's how I see it, and I think there are a lot of opportunities really packed into that. And low carbon economy is also driving a lot of new businesses. And now, like in the circular economy, it's largely formalizing in the informal sector, where people are recycling things. That's one. Just to keep it simple. Mm-hmm. There's also the blue economy that most of us have had for the first time, probably because we have a minister that of the blue economy. There's a lot of value chain that is also there that is lying fallow that people are not harnessing. Then the green economy, which we are all used to, of course, because that speaks to the fossil fuel transitioning. So what I would say to you, Petra, and to the country, is that we shouldn't look at just transition in one perspective. We should also look at it through this perspective of what are the opportunities that can be in there for us.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Obaisa-Osula, Head, ESG, Sustainability and Climate Change, PwC Nigeria. I must say we have a lot more to talk about, but I just have to let you go at this point.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we have one more conversation for you. Stay with us. Amidst escalating concerns about climate change, carbon capture technology emerges as a critical solution for curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Its adoption carries significant implications for countries like South Africa, balancing economic development with environmental preservation. Joining me for more on this is Tumi Como, CEO, EPCM Global Engineering. He joins me from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon over there, but it's morning here. Well, the capture and... Absolutely.
Apologies.
Yeah, it's okay. The capture and storage of carbon dioxide, that's CCS, has been identified as one of the fundamental approaches to mitigating global climate change. I'd like you to tell us how much of a solution this is.
So CCS is a strategy that internationally has been examined as a way of dealing with excess carbon in the environment. And it has been successful. There has been one that is piloted for South Africa, but we are in the carbon capture and utilization in space where we believe after capturing the carbon, there's significant value within the economy and downstream enterprises. So it's, for us, carbon is a commodity.
Just before we move on, I mean, I'm just wondering if this solution can replace calls, to jettison fossil fuel.
No. So there's a fundamental physics problem that everybody refuses to acknowledge, and that is oxidation will always produce some kind of carbon dioxide. And therefore, it is important that we acknowledge that there is the primary CO2 emissions, and then there's a secondary CO2 emission. So you can deal with the coal or the jettison fuels, or ignore the fact that the actual process may produce more CO2 than the original primary energy. So we have to combine these if we're ever to attain a net zero position. And you have to scrub both of these out of the industrial process. And at this stage, I don't see anybody having a solution to oxidation. So it's better we deal with the problem than trying to change the energy source.
All right, well, South Africa has just recently launched carbon capture technology. I'd like you to explain how carbon capture technology works and its significance in the context of South Africa's recent launch.
Okay. So typically in a combustion industry, whether it's metal, whether it's energy, whether it's any kind of industrial process, you produce your SOx, your NOx, your particulate matter, and your CO2. Now, what we've done is we've designed a plant where we can extract the heavy metals and the dust particles to a very low level. Then we separate the SOx and convert it into a sulfuric acid. And then we then take the gas and put it through another reactor where we separate the CO2 from the flue gas, and we make an ammonium bicarbonate, which is a fertilizer salt base. And then if there is still ammonia drag in our smoke, we then push it through another reactor where we mix the sulfuric acid with the ammonia that we captured, and we make an ammonium sulfate, which is another fertilizer-based salt. And therefore, by the time we finish, we've dealt with all of these, and then we have the last reactor where we absorb the NOx, which is pretty much not a problem, but it's just not worth the financial effort to actually separate the NOx. And so we've just left it that way, and we come out with a 99% clean flue gas.
I mean, I'd like you to quickly differentiate between CCS and CCU. You started, talking about that earlier, but you sort of concentrated on what South Africa is doing. But I'd like you to differentiate between the two, and why South Africa has chosen to go for CCU.
Okay, so CCS is when we capture the gas, the carbon, condense it, and then push it underground for storage facilities, and that program is still going ahead. But we've also realized that there is value in carbon. So typically in the carbon CCU, which is the utilization, which is the technology we're in, is you take all of these flue gas concentrations and you make a circular economy, industrial chemical or agricultural chemical. And that allows you to put it back into the system and reduces the need for additional chemicals into a growing economy. So all of a sudden, what was a climate change requirement becomes a financial opportunity. You produce a huge amount of chemicals which go into industrial processes. Some of this CO2, funny enough, goes into the proposed syn fuel. So you can make a 0 ppm kerosene, which is what we started exploring, is we can make a 0 ppm kerosene from smoke, from industrial processes. So this is where the difference is. We make chemicals that can be used again, therefore reducing the requirement of the flow of chemicals within the environment.
All right, so talk to us about... Oh, please go ahead. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to check if you're happy with my CCU and CCUS question.
Absolutely. All right, so how accessible is this technology to industries and sectors in South Africa, and then what support is available for its widespread implementation, saying, the importance really?
So there is a slow uptake. I mean, we've been in this conversation with a lot of South African industries for almost 5 years, but it's because it's a paradigm shift. You have now said to them, what was waste is now commercial opportunity. And sometimes that commercial opportunity is bigger than the primary business you started with in the first place. So that's the one bit. The second bit is that South Africa is thinking of this thing in a very simplistic manner, and they're saying, can we consume all these chemicals? And we're saying, no, It's a global requirement. These chemicals apply globally. You produce them at low pressure and temperature, so therefore the cost of these chemicals are very low. So it's adapting to that, and I'm seeing everybody's catching up slowly, and we are starting to explore implementation in different industries. Steel, there's a bit of reluctance, but we're happy. We're more than happy to test in front of them, let them see, let them have independent reviewers look at the technology. And I think that's what changes South Africa. All of a sudden, we have enough fertilizer to turn the country around, but to turn every other destination within Africa around to be self-sufficient from a food perspective.
All right, thank you so much. But just before you go, I know you've talked about the importance of, spreading it wide and all of that, but do you see any potential challenges, limitations, or risks associated with the adoption of carbon capture technology in South Africa? If you can do this in less than 30 minutes, I'll be grateful. 30 seconds, rather.
Yes, that is. So the trick is to make sure that you don't destroy existing industries. And what it does for anybody who has existing infrastructure, it gives them 30-year headroom to continue with their current asset at their current NPV, as opposed to having to buy new technologies. So it's a sweet spot for every industry in South Africa, but everybody's going through it for different reasons.
Thank you, Tony Como, CEO, EPCM Global Engineering, for your thoughts. So that's it. All right. That's it on this edition of Business Edge. You can follow us on social media. We are at New Century TV. You can also go to our website, www.newcentury.africa. You can download our mobile app on Play Store and on App Store. Till next time, I am Perpetua Fasanmi-Peter. Bye for now.